Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his horse through the rocky canyon. The summer heat in Arizona was unbearable, and he had been traveling for 3 days straight. His water supply was running dangerously low, but he pressed on, hoping to reach the next trading post before nightfall. As a traveling merchant, Marcus had made this journey dozens of times over the past 5 years. He knew every twist and turn of the desert trails, every watering hole, and every danger that lurked in the wilderness. But today felt different somehow. The usual sounds of desert wildlife were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Marcus spotted something unusual ahead. A figure lay motionless beside a cluster of desert sage, partially hidden in the shadow of a large boulder. At first he thought it might be a discarded piece of clothing or equipment left by another traveler. But as he drew closer, his heart sank when he realized it was a person. Marcus quickly dismounted and rushed to the fallen figure. It was a young Indigenous man, probably in his early 20s, wearing traditional clothing that Marcus recognized as belonging to one of the local tribes. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, his lips cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration. A nasty gash on his leg had been crudely bandaged with torn fabric, but blood had seeped through the makeshift dressing. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his water canteen and gently lifted the man's head. He carefully poured small amounts of water between the stranger's parched lips, watching as the liquid brought a flicker of consciousness to his eyes. The young man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark eyes filled with pain and confusion. "Easy there, friend," Marcus said softly, continuing to offer small sips of water. "You're going to be all right." "What happened to you?" The Indigenous man tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper in his native language that Marcus couldn't understand. However, the gratitude in his eyes was unmistakable. Marcus could see that this person had been lying here for quite some time, probably since the previous night or even longer. Marcus examined the leg wound more closely. It looked like it could have been caused by a wild animal attack, possibly a mountain lion or bear. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the wound needed proper cleaning and fresh bandages. Using his own supplies, Marcus carefully cleaned the injury with some of his precious water and rebandaged it with clean cloth from his pack. As he worked, Marcus noticed several other concerning details about the young man's condition. His skin was burning with fever, and there were other smaller cuts and bruises covering his arms and torso. It was clear that he had been through some kind of ordeal before ending up here in the desert. The merchant faced a difficult decision. His water supply was already critically low, and sharing it with this stranger meant putting his own survival at risk. The next reliable water source was still a full day's ride away, and there was no guarantee he would make it if he gave away too much of what he had left. But Marcus couldn't bring himself to abandon someone in such desperate need. His own father had taught him that a person's character was measured not by what they did when it was convenient, but by their actions when doing the right thing came at great personal cost. He continued giving the young man water, a few drops at a time, until he began to show signs of recovery. Color slowly returned to his cheeks and his breathing became more regular. After about an hour of careful nursing, the stranger was able to sit up with assistance. Using simple gestures and the few words of English the young man seemed to understand, Marcus learned that his name was something that sounded like Ayana, though the exact pronunciation was difficult for him to master. Ayana pointed toward the mountains in the distance and then to his injured leg, seeming to indicate that he had traveled a long way before his injury forced him to stop. As the sun began to set, Marcus realized he needed to make camp for the night. Traveling in the dark through this terrain would be suicide, especially with an injured companion. He helped Ayana to a more comfortable spot near some rocks that would provide shelter from the wind, then gathered whatever dry wood he could find to build a small fire. Throughout the evening, Marcus continued sharing his water and what little food he had. He gave Ayana strips of dried meat and hardtack biscuits, watching as the young man slowly regained his strength. They couldn't communicate much through words, but there was an understanding between them that transcended language barriers. As they sat by the flickering campfire under a canopy of desert stars, Marcus couldn't help but wonder about Ayana's story. What had brought him to this desolate place? Where was he trying to go? And most importantly, would anyone come looking for him? The merchant had heard stories from other travelers about the various tribes in the region. Some were said to be peaceful and welcoming to outsiders, while others were reportedly hostile toward anyone who encroached on their ancestral lands. He had always tried to maintain respectful relationships with the indigenous peoples he encountered during his travels. But he knew that tensions sometimes ran high between his people and theirs. Despite these concerns, Marcus felt a growing sense of responsibility for his new companion. Something about the young man's quiet dignity and grateful demeanor had touched him deeply. As he settled down for the night, keeping the fire burning to ward off desert predators, Marcus made a silent promise to himself that he would do everything in his power to help Ayanna recover and find his way home safely. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and both men huddled close to the fire for warmth. Marcus noticed that Ayanna seemed restless, occasionally staring off toward the mountains with an expression of deep concern. Whatever had happened to bring him to this place, it was clear that it weighed heavily on his mind. As Marcus finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Marcus woke at dawn to find Ayanna already awake, sitting up and looking much stronger than the night before. The young man's fever had broken during the night, and though he was still weak, there was a new alertness in his eyes that hadn't been there the evening before. They shared the last of Marcus's dried fruit for breakfast, along with careful sips of water from the nearly empty canteen. Marcus knew they were in a dangerous situation now. With less than a quarter of his water remaining, they needed to reach the trading post by midday or risk severe dehydration themselves. Ayanna seemed to understand their predicament. He pointed toward a different direction than the route Marcus had planned to take, gesturing emphatically and speaking in his native language. Though Marcus couldn't understand the words, the young man's tone and body language suggested urgency. After several minutes of attempted communication through gestures and simple drawings in the sand, Marcus began to grasp what Ayanna was trying to tell him. There was apparently a hidden spring somewhere in the direction the young man was indicating, much closer than the trading post Marcus had been aiming for. Marcus faced another crucial decision. His instinct was to stick to the familiar route he had traveled many times before. Deviating from known paths in the desert was typically a death sentence for travelers. But their water situation was becoming desperate, and Ayanna seemed genuinely convinced that salvation lay in the direction he was pointing. The merchant studied the young man's face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or confusion that might indicate fever-induced delusions. But Ayanna's eyes were clear and determined, and he continued pointing toward the rocky hills with unwavering certainty. Trust, Marcus realized, was a two-way street. Ayanna had trusted him completely the night before, accepting food and water from a stranger without hesitation. Now it was Marcus's turn to show the same faith. "All right, friend," Marcus said, helping Ayanna to his feet. "I hope you know what you're talking about." They set off in the new direction, with Ayanna riding behind Marcus on the horse despite his injured leg. The young man served as their guide, occasionally pointing left or right to adjust their course. He seemed to recognize landmarks that were invisible to Marcus's untrained eye. Small rock formations and desert plants that apparently served as natural trail markers. The terrain grew increasingly rough as they climbed into the foothills. Marcus's horse struggled with the rocky ground and steep inclines, and he began to worry that they were making a terrible mistake. The sun was climbing higher, and their water was nearly gone. Just when Marcus was about to suggest they turn back toward the familiar trail, Ayanna suddenly became excited, pointing ahead and speaking rapidly in his native language. Around the next bend, hidden in a small canyon between two rocky walls, Marcus saw the most beautiful sight of his life. A clear, bubbling spring surrounded by green vegetation. They both slid down from the horse and rushed to the water's edge. Marcus had never tasted anything so sweet and refreshing. They drank deeply, refilled their containers, and allowed the horse to drink its fill as well. The spring was fed by an underground source, ensuring a steady supply of fresh, clean water. As they rested in the shade of some cottonwood trees that grew near the spring, Marcus began to understand how remarkable his companion truly was. Ayanna had guided them to this hidden oasis despite being injured, fevered, and barely conscious when they started the journey. His knowledge of the desert was far superior to Marcus's own, accumulated through years of living in harmony with this harsh landscape. Over the course of the day, as they recovered their strength, the two men began to communicate more effectively. Ayana had picked up some English words during previous encounters with traders and settlers, while Marcus remembered a few phrases in Spanish that seemed to bridge some of their language gap. Through their halting conversation, Marcus learned that Ayana was not just any member of his tribe, but someone of considerable importance. He was the son of a respected elder, and his people would indeed be looking for him. He had been on a spiritual journey, a traditional rite of passage that required him to spend time alone in the wilderness. When he had encountered the mountain lion that injured his leg, Ayana also revealed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The attack had occurred near a sacred site that was considered extremely important to his people. The area had been a source of tension recently, as miners and settlers had been encroaching on tribal lands. Some young warriors in the tribe were advocating for violent resistance to these intrusions. The implications of this information slowly dawned on Marcus. If Ayana's people discovered that he had been injured near their sacred site, and if they associated his rescue with the presence of outsiders in their territory, it could lead to serious conflict. The fact that Marcus was a white trader who regularly traveled through their lands might make him a target for retaliation. But Ayana seemed to read the concern in Marcus's expression. The young man placed a reassuring hand on the trader's shoulder and spoke earnestly in his limited English, mixing in words from his own language. Though Marcus couldn't understand everything, the message was clear. Ayana considered him a friend and would make sure his people understood that Marcus had saved his life. As the afternoon wore on, they both knew that Ayana's strength was returning enough for him to attempt to make his way back to his village. The spring had provided them with the water and rest they needed, and staying here much longer would only delay the inevitable reunion with his tribe. Marcus helped Ayana prepare for his journey, sharing some of his supplies and making sure the young man had enough food and water for the trip home. They both understood that their paths would likely diverge here, and that this brief but intense friendship might be coming to an end. But Ayana had other ideas. As Marcus prepared to continue toward the trading post alone, the young man grabbed his arm and shook his head emphatically. He pointed toward the mountains where his village lay, then pointed to Marcus, clearly indicating that the trader should accompany him. Marcus hesitated. Entering an indigenous village uninvited could be extremely dangerous, especially given the current tensions in the region. But Ayana was insistent, and Marcus realized that the young man might actually need his help to make the journey safely. The leg wound, while improved, was still serious enough to slow him down considerably. After a long moment of internal debate, Marcus made his decision. He would escort Ayana partway toward his village, at least until they encountered other members of his tribe who could take over his care. It seemed like the right thing to do, and Marcus had always tried to live by the principle of seeing through the commitments he made. As they set off together toward the distant mountains, neither man could have imagined the extraordinary events that would unfold as a result of this simple act of human kindness. The journey toward Ayana's village took them through some of the most breathtaking and treacherous terrain Marcus had ever encountered. They climbed narrow mountain paths that seemed to have been carved by ancient floods, crossed rushing streams that cascaded down from hidden peaks, and navigated through forests of pine and oak that provided welcome relief from the desert heat. Ayana's knowledge of the landscape continued to amaze Marcus. The young man knew exactly where to find shelter when sudden afternoon thunderstorms rolled in, which plants could be eaten safely, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated they were traveling through different tribal territories. He also seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense when they were being watched. On their second day of travel together, Marcus began to notice that they were indeed being observed. Occasionally he would catch glimpses of movement in the trees above them, or spot a figure on a distant ridge who would disappear the moment he looked directly at them. Ayana seemed aware of this surveillance but showed no signs of concern, which helped keep Marcus's nerves under control. Their unseen escorts were clearly Ayana's people, scouts who had been searching for the missing young man. Marcus realized that word of their approach was probably being carried ahead of them to the village, which meant that the tribe's leaders would have time to prepare for the arrival of an unexpected white visitor. As they traveled, Ayana continued to teach Marcus words and phrases in his language, while learning more English himself. Their conversations became increasingly complex, and Marcus began to understand the depth of his companion's wisdom and intelligence. Ayana spoke about his people's history, their connection to the land, and their growing concerns about the changes being brought by the influx of settlers and miners. The young man also shared stories about his own life and dreams. He had been chosen by the tribal elders to potentially become a bridge between his people and the outside world, someone who could help navigate the complex relationships that would be necessary for the tribe's survival in changing times. His spiritual journey into the wilderness had been part of his preparation for this important role. Marcus found himself sharing his own story as well. He talked about his childhood in Ohio, his decision to become a traveling merchant, and his experiences during 5 years of traversing the Western Territories. He spoke about his respect for the indigenous peoples he had encountered, and his belief that cooperation and mutual understanding were preferable to conflict and mistrust. On the evening of their second day together, as they camped beside a mountain stream, Ayanna made an announcement that surprised Marcus. The young man explained that they would reach his village the following morning, and that Marcus would be welcomed as an honored guest. However, there were certain protocols and customs that needed to be observed. Ayanna spent considerable time that evening coaching Marcus on proper behavior for meeting his tribal leaders. He explained the significance of various gestures, the importance of showing respect for the elders, and the traditional gift-giving customs that would be expected. Marcus listened carefully, understanding that any mistakes on his part could have serious consequences for both of them. The young man also warned Marcus about the current political situation within the tribe. There were 2 main factions with very different views about how to deal with the increasing presence of outsiders in their territory. One group, led by Ayanna's father and other older leaders, favored diplomatic solutions and careful negotiation. The other faction, composed mainly of younger warriors, believed that only force would protect their people's rights and way of life. Marcus's arrival would inevitably become part of this ongoing debate. His treatment of Ayanna would be viewed as evidence supporting one side or the other. If the tribal council decided that his actions demonstrated the possibility of peaceful coexistence with white settlers, it could strengthen the position of the moderate leaders. But if the warrior faction convinced the council that accepting help from outsiders showed weakness or naivety, it could lead to a very different outcome. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily on Marcus's mind as he tried to sleep that night. He had simply been trying to help a fellow human being in distress, but somehow that simple act had placed him at the center of a complex political situation that could affect the lives of hundreds of people. When morning came, Marcus took special care with his appearance, washing thoroughly in the stream and putting on the cleanest clothes he had. Ayanna had stressed the importance of making a good first impression, and Marcus wanted to show proper respect for the people who were about to welcome him into their home. As they broke camp and continued their journey, the signs of human habitation became more obvious. They passed cultivated fields where corn, beans, and squash grew in neat rows, and saw smoke rising from cooking fires in the distance. Dogs began barking somewhere ahead of them, announcing their approach to anyone within earshot. Finally, they crested a small hill, and Marcus got his first view of Ayanna's village. It was larger and more sophisticated than he had expected, with dozens of well-constructed dwellings arranged around a central plaza. Gardens and workshops were scattered throughout the settlement, and a clear stream provided fresh water for the entire community. But what struck Marcus most forcefully was the complete absence of people. The village appeared to be deserted, with no signs of the normal daily activities he would have expected to see. Doors and windows were closed, and an eerie silence hung over the entire settlement. Ayanna noticed Marcus's confusion and smiled reassuringly. He explained that the village elders had decided to observe traditional protocols for receiving an important visitor. Everyone had withdrawn to allow the formal welcoming ceremony to proceed without distractions or interruptions. As they approached the central plaza, Marcus saw movement at last. A small group of dignified older men emerged from one of the larger buildings, dressed in ceremonial clothing and moving with the slow, measured pace of formal ritual. Behind them came a larger group that included warriors, women, and children, all watching the proceedings with intense curiosity. Ayanna dismounted from the horse and walked forward to greet the elders, speaking rapidly in his native language. Marcus remained mounted, unsure of what he was supposed to do next. He could see Ayanna gesturing toward him, and explaining something at length to the assembled leaders. After several minutes of conversation, one of the elders stepped forward and addressed Marcus directly in surprisingly good English. The man introduced himself as Standing Bear, Ayana's father and one of the tribe's most respected leaders. He formally welcomed Marcus to their village and invited him to participate in a ceremony of gratitude for saving his son's life. As Marcus dismounted and was led toward the center of the plaza, he realized that his simple act of compassion beside a desert trail was about to transform his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The ceremony that followed would bind him to these people and their future, in ways that neither he nor they could fully comprehend at that moment. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in his life. Standing Bear led him to a special place in the center of the plaza, where a fire had been prepared with aromatic woods that filled the air with sweet smoke. The entire community gathered in a large circle around them, from the smallest children to the oldest grandmothers, all dressed in their finest clothing and jewelry. Ayana stood beside his father and began telling the story of his rescue, speaking in his native language but occasionally looking at Marcus with gratitude shining in his eyes. Even though Marcus couldn't understand the words, he could sense the emotion and drama in Ayana's telling. The young man described his injury, his desperate situation in the desert, and Marcus's decision to share his precious water despite the risk to his own survival. When Ayana finished his account, several of the tribal elders took turns speaking. Marcus learned later that each was sharing their own thoughts about what his actions meant to their community. Some spoke about the importance of showing kindness to strangers, while others discussed the significance of preserving life even at personal cost. A few of the older women shared stories from tribal tradition about similar acts of heroism and compassion. Standing Bear then presented Marcus with several gifts that had been specially chosen to honor his deed. The first was a beautiful blanket woven from the finest wool, decorated with geometric patterns that told the story of their people's journey to this land. The second was a carved wooden staff topped with eagle feathers, which Standing Bear explained was a symbol of wisdom and courage that would protect Marcus during his travels. But the most significant gift was a necklace made from rare turquoise stones and silver, crafted by the tribe's most skilled artisan. Standing Bear explained that this necklace carried special spiritual significance and would identify Marcus as a friend and protector of their people, wherever he might travel in the region. Any member of their tribe or their allies who saw this necklace would know immediately that Marcus was to be treated with respect and offered assistance if needed. The ceremony concluded with a feast that seemed to include the entire village. Long tables were set up in the plaza, laden with dishes that showcased the community's agricultural abundance and culinary skills. Marcus tasted roasted corn prepared in ways he had never imagined, stews made from local game and wild plants, and bread baked with native grains that had flavors completely new to his palate. Throughout the meal, various members of the community approached Marcus to thank him personally for saving Ayana's life. Many of them spoke at least some English, and he learned that several had traveled extensively in the outside world for trade or diplomatic purposes. Their leader, Standing Bear, had even visited Washington, D.C. several years earlier as part of a delegation trying to negotiate land rights with the federal government. As the evening progressed, Marcus began to understand the complex challenges facing this community. They were caught between their desire to maintain their traditional way of life and the practical necessity of adapting to the rapidly changing world around them. White settlers were arriving in increasing numbers, bringing with them new diseases, different ideas about land ownership, and technologies that could be both beneficial and disruptive. The tribal council was deeply divided about how to respond to these changes. Some members believed that their survival depended on learning to work with the newcomers, finding ways to benefit from trade and new opportunities, while preserving their most important cultural values. Others argued that any accommodation with the settlers would inevitably lead to the destruction of their people's identity and independence. Standing Bear himself was clearly a pragmatist who favored careful engagement with the outside world. During their conversation, he spoke eloquently about his vision for a future where his people could maintain their sovereignty and cultural integrity while also participating in the broader regional economy. He saw education and diplomacy as their best weapons against those who would take advantage of them. But Marcus also met some of the younger warriors who held very different views. These men, led by a charismatic leader named Thundercloud, believed that the only way to preserve their people's freedom was through resistance and, if necessary, warfare. They had been advocating for more aggressive responses to encroachments on tribal land, and some had even talked about raiding settler camps and mining operations. The arrival of Marcus, and the story of his kindness to Ayana, had become a symbol in this ongoing debate. Standing Bear and his supporters pointed to the rescue as evidence that not all white people were enemies, and that building relationships with trustworthy outsiders could benefit their community. Thundercloud's faction, however, remained skeptical, arguing that one man's kindness didn't change the fundamental threat posed by continued white expansion into their territory. As the feast wound down and people began returning to their homes, Standing Bear invited Marcus to spend several days in the village as their guest. He explained that there were other tribal leaders from neighboring communities who would want to meet the man who had saved Ayana's life, and that his presence could help facilitate important discussions about regional cooperation and peace. Marcus agreed to stay, partly out of curiosity about this fascinating community, but also because he was beginning to understand that his role in recent events might be more significant than he had initially realized. If his actions could somehow contribute to peaceful relations between the tribes and the growing number of settlers in the region, then perhaps his unexpected detour from his normal trading route had served a greater purpose. That night, as Marcus lay on a comfortable bed in the guest lodge that had been prepared for him, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this place. Just a few days earlier, he had been a simple traveling merchant with no greater ambition than completing his trading circuit and earning enough money to expand his business. Now he found himself at the center of complex political discussions that could affect the future of thousands of people. The turquoise necklace lay heavy around his neck, not just because of its physical weight, but because of the responsibility it represented. He was no longer just Marcus the trader, but Marcus the bridge builder, Marcus the friend of the tribes, Marcus the man who had chosen compassion over self-preservation when it mattered most. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what new challenges and opportunities the coming days would bring. He was beginning to suspect that his old life of simple trading circuits and predictable profits was over, replaced by something far more complex and potentially far more meaningful. Outside his window, the sounds of the village settling in for the night gradually gave way to the natural symphony of the mountain wilderness. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus knew that scouts and messengers were probably already carrying news of his arrival to other tribal communities throughout the region. Word would spread about the white trader who had saved Ayana's life, and people would form their own opinions about what his presence might mean for their future. The stage was being set for events that would test not only Marcus's courage and wisdom, but also his commitment to the principles that had guided his actions in the desert. The real adventure, he realized, was just beginning. Marcus woke before dawn to the sound of many horses approaching the village. He looked out the window of his guest lodge and was amazed to see riders streaming down the mountain paths from multiple directions, their numbers growing with each passing minute. By the time the sun had fully risen, what appeared to be hundreds of indigenous warriors, elders, and leaders had assembled in and around the village plaza. Standing Bear appeared at Marcus's door, dressed in his most formal ceremonial clothing and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. He explained that word of Marcus's rescue of Ayana had spread throughout the entire region with remarkable speed. Representatives from more than a dozen different tribal communities had traveled through the night to witness this historic moment and meet the white man who had shown such extraordinary compassion. As Marcus dressed quickly and prepared to join the gathering, Standing Bear briefed him on the significance of what was happening. Many of these tribal leaders had been at odds with each other for years, competing for hunting grounds, water rights, and influence with government officials. The fact that they had all come together in one place was unprecedented in recent memory. When Marcus emerged from his lodge, he was overwhelmed by the sight that greeted him. The village plaza, which had seemed spacious during the previous evening's feast, now appeared small and crowded with people from many different communities. He could see the distinctive clothing and decorations of various tribal groups, each maintaining their own cultural identity, even as they participated in this remarkable gathering. Ayana approached Marcus with a wide smile and explained what had transpired during the night. Messengers had carried the story of his rescue to tribal communities throughout the mountains and desert regions. But the story had grown in the telling, becoming something much larger than a simple act of individual kindness. Various tribal leaders had interpreted Marcus's actions as a sign that positive relationships with certain white settlers might be possible. Others saw it as an opportunity to present a united front when dealing with government officials and land speculators who had been pressuring individual tribes to sell their territories. A few visionary leaders had even begun to discuss the possibility of forming a regional confederation that could better protect all their people's interests. The formal proceedings began when Standing Bear called for attention and introduced Marcus to the assembled crowd. As Ayanna had done the previous day, Standing Bear told the story of the rescue, but this time his audience included some of the most powerful and influential Indigenous leaders in the entire territory. When Standing Bear finished speaking, other leaders began to share their own thoughts and experiences. Some told stories of positive interactions they had had with individual white settlers or traders. Others recounted betrayals and broken promises that had cost their people dearly. A few spoke about their vision for a future where their children could benefit from the best aspects of both traditional ways and new opportunities, without losing their cultural identity or independence. Marcus listened with growing amazement as the discussion evolved into something far more complex and significant than he had ever imagined possible. These leaders weren't just talking about his individual actions, but about the broader possibilities for peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit between Indigenous communities and the right kind of white settlers. Chief Running Wolf, an elderly leader whose reputation for wisdom extended far beyond his own tribe, stood to address the gathering. He spoke about the need for Indigenous peoples to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential values and traditions. He praised Marcus not just for his kindness to Ayanna, but for demonstrating that some outsiders could be trusted to honor the principles of reciprocity and respect that were fundamental to Indigenous culture. But not everyone in the crowd was convinced that Marcus's actions represented a meaningful change in the relationship between their peoples and the white settlers. Thundercloud, the young warrior leader Marcus had met the previous evening, rose to voice his skepticism. He acknowledged that Marcus had behaved honorably, but argued that one man's kindness couldn't compensate for the systematic injustices and broken promises that characterized most interactions with white authorities. The debate that followed was intense but respectful, with various leaders sharing their perspectives on how best to protect their people's interests in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Marcus found himself at the center of discussions that touched on everything from trade relationships and territorial boundaries to education opportunities and religious freedom. As the day progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The various tribal leaders started finding common ground on issues that had previously divided them. The shared experience of trying to navigate relationships with white settlers and government officials had given them similar challenges and concerns. Marcus's story provided a focal point around which they could imagine new possibilities for regional cooperation and mutual support. By afternoon, the leaders had begun drafting what they called a Declaration of Unity and Purpose. This document outlined their shared commitment to preserving Indigenous sovereignty while also establishing protocols for positive relationships with trustworthy outsiders. It established procedures for sharing information about threats to any member community, created mechanisms for coordinating diplomatic efforts, and set standards for evaluating potential trading partners and allies. Marcus was both honored and terrified to learn that he was being named as the first friend of the Confederated tribes under this new agreement. The position would make him a formal diplomatic representative who could speak on behalf of the Tribal Confederation in dealings with white settlers, government officials, and business interests. But it would also make him a target for those who opposed any form of accommodation between Indigenous peoples and outsiders. As the sun began to set on this remarkable day, the various tribal leaders prepared to return to their home communities. But before departing, they participated in a ceremony that would create lasting bonds between their peoples and establish Marcus as a permanent bridge between their world and the world of white settlers. The ceremony involved the creation of what they called a sacred bundle of friendship which contained symbolic items, contributed by each participating tribe. This bundle would travel with Marcus during his journeys, serving as both protection and identification. Any member of any confederated tribe who saw this bundle would know immediately that Marcus spoke with the authority of all their leaders, chief. Running Wolf presented Marcus with a special commission, written on deerskin and sealed with the marks of more than 30 tribal leaders. This document formally appointed him as a peace ambassador and granted him safe passage throughout the entire region. But more importantly, it charged him with a sacred responsibility to promote understanding and cooperation between indigenous peoples and the white settlers who were arriving in ever-increasing numbers. As the last of the tribal representatives departed under the light of a full moon, Marcus realized that his life had been completely transformed. He was no longer a simple traveling merchant pursuing personal profit, but a diplomat carrying the hopes and dreams of thousands of people who were struggling to find their place in a rapidly changing world. Standing Bear approached him as he stood alone in the plaza, contemplating the magnitude of his new responsibilities. The elder leader placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder and spoke quietly about the challenges that lay ahead. There would be those on both sides who would oppose his efforts to build bridges between their peoples. Some white settlers would view him as a traitor to his own race, while some indigenous warriors would always suspect his motives. But Standing Bear also spoke about the incredible opportunity that had been placed before Marcus. If he succeeded in his new role, he could help prevent the conflicts and tragedies that had marked relationships between indigenous peoples and white settlers in other parts of the country. He could help create a model for coexistence that might serve as an example for communities throughout the Western Territories. As Marcus prepared to retire for the night, he understood that tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most important and dangerous period of his life. The simple act of sharing water with a wounded stranger had set in motion events that would test his courage, wisdom, and integrity in ways he could never have imagined. 6 months later, Marcus sat in the governor's office in the territorial capital, wearing his turquoise necklace and carrying the sacred bundle of friendship as he negotiated the most important agreement of his life. The month since leaving Ayana's village had been filled with challenges that would have broken a lesser man, but they had also brought victories that exceeded his wildest dreams. His new role as friend of the confederated tribes had taken him to settlements and mining camps throughout the territory, where he worked tirelessly to prevent conflicts and establish fair trading relationships. Some white settlers had initially viewed him with suspicion, questioning his loyalty and motives. But Marcus's honest dealings and his ability to resolve disputes peacefully had gradually won over even his harshest critics. The sacred bundle had proven to be more powerful than he had ever imagined. Whenever tensions arose between white settlers and indigenous communities, Marcus's appearance with the bundle immediately commanded respect from tribal members, and often defused dangerous situations before they could escalate into violence. Word of his unique position had spread throughout the territory, and both sides had learned to seek his mediation when serious disputes arose. But Marcus's greatest success had come in the economic realm. He had helped establish a network of fair trading posts where indigenous communities could exchange their goods for manufactured items, tools, and other necessities at honest prices. These trading relationships had created prosperity for both indigenous peoples and white merchants, while building the kind of mutual dependence that made conflict less likely. The agreement he was negotiating with Governor Harrison would formalize these arrangements and provide legal protection for the tribal confederation's rights. It would establish permanent boundaries for tribal lands, guarantee access to traditional hunting and gathering areas, and create mechanisms for resolving disputes through peaceful means rather than violence. Governor Harrison, a practical man who had seen too much bloodshed in other territories, had come to appreciate Marcus's unique position and abilities. The governor knew that the alternative to this negotiated settlement would likely be years of costly and destructive warfare that would benefit no one except those who profited from conflict. As they worked through the final details of the agreement, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in the desert when he had encountered Ayana. He had given up his old life as a simple trader pursuing personal profit, but he had gained something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and the knowledge that his actions were making a real difference in the lives of thousands of people. Ayana had become his closest ally and friend during these months of diplomatic work. The young man's intelligence, cultural knowledge, and natural diplomatic skills had proven invaluable in navigating the complex relationships between different tribal groups and white communities. Together, they had developed innovative solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier. The signing ceremony for the territorial agreement took place on a beautiful autumn day, with representatives from more than 20 tribal communities joining Governor Harrison and other territorial officials. Standing Bear served as the primary spokesperson for the tribal confederation, but he made sure that everyone understood Marcus's crucial role in making the agreement possible. As Marcus watched the various leaders sign the historic document, he thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. It had all started with a simple decision to share water with a stranger in need, but it had grown into something that would affect generations of people yet to be born. The celebration that followed the signing ceremony was held in the same village plaza where Marcus had first been, honored by Ayana's people, but this time the gathering included not only tribal leaders but also white settlers, territorial officials, and business leaders who had benefited from the peaceful relationships that Marcus had helped establish. Children from both indigenous and white families played together in the plaza, their laughter and games providing a hopeful vision of what the future might hold. Young people who had grown up during the months of negotiation and cooperation seemed to take the friendship between their communities for granted, as if peaceful coexistence was the natural order of things. During the celebration, Chief Running Wolf presented Marcus with one final honor: adoption into the tribal confederation as a permanent member with full rights and responsibilities. The ceremony was conducted in the traditional manner, with Marcus formally accepting the obligations that came with his new status as a member of the extended tribal family. Standing Bear spoke about the lessons that Marcus's story had taught their people. He explained that true strength came not from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the wisdom to transform enemies into friends. The elder leader praised Marcus for demonstrating that courage could be shown not just in battle, but in the daily choice to extend compassion and trust to those who might not deserve it. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus found himself sitting with Ayana beside the same stream where they had first learned to communicate months earlier. The young man had fully recovered from his injuries and had emerged as one of the most respected voices in the tribal confederation. His experience during the rescue had shaped his own understanding of the possibilities for positive relationships with outsiders. Ayana spoke about his dreams for the future, which now included plans to establish schools where children from both communities could learn together, sharing knowledge and building friendships that would last throughout their lives. He had also begun working on a written history of their people that would preserve traditional stories, while also documenting this remarkable period of cooperation and change. Marcus shared his own plans, which centered around expanding the network of fair trading posts and peaceful settlements throughout the Western Territories. He had received invitations from other regions where conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples were threatening to explode into warfare. His reputation as a successful peacemaker had spread far beyond their own territory, and he felt obligated to share what he had learned with others who faced similar challenges. But both men understood that their work was far from finished. There would always be those on both sides who preferred conflict to cooperation, who saw compromise as weakness rather than wisdom. The agreements they had negotiated would need constant attention and protection to prevent them from being undermined by extremists and troublemakers. As they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the celebration continuing in the village behind them, Marcus marveled at how much his understanding of success and happiness had changed. 6 months earlier, he had measured his worth by the profits from his trading ventures and the size of his savings account. Now he understood that true wealth came from the relationships he had built and the positive impact his actions had on other people's lives. The turquoise necklace around his neck had become more than just a symbol of friendship with indigenous peoples. It had become a reminder of his responsibility to choose compassion over selfishness in every situation he encountered. The sacred bundle of friendship that he carried represented not just his authority as a diplomatic representative, but his commitment to the principles of respect, reciprocity, and mutual understanding that had made all their achievements possible. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Marcus knew that his story was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new relationships to build, and new opportunities to demonstrate that different peoples could live together in peace and prosperity. But he also knew that he would never again be the same simple trader who had been traveling alone through the desert just months before. The man who had given water to a wounded stranger had discovered that small acts of kindness could indeed change the world, but only if they were followed by the much harder work of building lasting relationships based on trust, respect, and genuine care for others' well-being. And in that discovery, Marcus had found not just a new career, but a new understanding of what it truly meant to live a meaningful and worthwhile life.